Hi everyone, this is the last video in my recent series of 6 that I've made for those of you that are just starting off with watercolour painting. In this video I'm going to show you some techniques that you can practice to help give your paintings a strong sense of visual interest. These are techniques that you can come back to time and again as you progress with your painting, and in fact I will show you a method that I continue to use in all of my paintings. So before I get started, I'd just like to say thanks very much to those of you that have already subscribed to the channel. That's much appreciated. Also, if you like the videos, just click on the thumbs up. That's really helpful too. And if you have a look in the video description, I will put links to the other videos in this series. And so if you haven't seen those, you can catch up at your leisure. Now, as I started painting watercolours years ago, I felt that I was making reasonable progress, but I got to a point where I thought that my paintings just seemed to be lacking something. They didn't seem to look like the paintings of those whose paintings I admired. And I thought, well, there must be something that I'm doing wrong. There must be something that's missing. Having given it quite a lot of thought, what I came to realise was that the washes that I was making were uninteresting, dare I say boring. Even. They were simply just putting colour down into positions where I wanted those colours to go, and my paintings looked okay. There wasn't too much wrong with them, but they're a bit flat, they're a bit dull, they didn't seem to have any dynamism to them, and certainly from my perspective, and I would imagine from other viewers as well, they lacked visual interest. So in this video, I'm not going to broaden it out and look at some of the bigger concepts that can help to give your paintings visual interest, like composition, understanding perspective, that type of thing. So all I'm going to do is give you some exercises and some tips and techniques that will help to prevent the washes that you make in your paintings from being uninteresting, boring possibly, and that will give your paintings some visual interest. And the first thing that I want to show you is something that may sound a bit unusual, but it's something that I refer to as painting in threes. And it's a method that I use in all of my paintings, where I will make an initial wash. That's my first go at painting. My second go is, as that wash is drying, I will add in some more concentrated paint. And then finally, just before that area dries, I will add in a third, even more concentrated amount of paint. And what that does is it makes the most of my wash. So often when we're painting watercolour, we'll paint an area, the side of a boat, for example. We've put it in and we'll just leave it. And we think, well, that's great, I've painted it. While that wash is still wet, and as it becomes damp, just before it dries, there are things we can do with it, and making the most of your wash is what will give your washes and your paintings a sense of visual interest. I'm then going to show you an exercise that will help you to add some texture into your paintings by varying your washes and your brush strokes, and then we will see that a good way of adding interest to your paintings is by removing and eradicating uniformity. So let me show you this idea of painting in threes. I think you're going to find it's really helpful. I've got two pools of colour mixed up on the palette here, French ultramarine and light red. You can see if I move the palette around, they're fairly loose consistency. What I mean by painting in threes is that I make 3 different approaches to the same wash while it's wet. Let me show you. And in this exercise, I'm not trying to paint anything in particular here. This is entirely abstract. And by not focusing on any particular subject, it'll help you just to understand and grasp the technique. So get one of your colours. It doesn't matter which one really. I'm going to put some blue on here, nice and wet. And then I'm going to get some light red, paint that in as well. And so I've got a variegated wash here of 2 different colours running together. Give yourself a nice big space on the paper to do this. Let that all run together. Okay, there we go. So while that's drying, take the same two colours and mix them together. Well, you don't have to. You could use just ultramarine or just light red, but I'm just going to mix the two. And you can see here that the consistency of the paint is substantially thicker than it is here. It's not running around the palette. It's a lot more viscous in its consistency. What I've painted here is my first go, my 1 of 3. I've put down the initial wash and I'm just going to let that dry up a little bit. And now that the glossy shine has gone off this, there's still a sheen to it because it's damp. I'm going to drop some of the colour in. Here's my first go at the wash. This is number 1 of 3, and here comes number 2. Just drop some of this in and you can see what happens. It adds a little extra to the wash. I'm working wet on wet here, and it's largely holding its shape and blending into what's on the paper. Like I said, this is abstract. It could be anything. Now again, as that's drying, I'm going to get some almost concentrated paint. Let's have a mix of the two again, that doesn't hurt. This goes back to what I called my sticky mixes from previous videos. And what I'm going to do now, just before this dries, while there's still a little bit of dampness in this area, I can drop in some dark. See, it's very wet down there, so that really didn't hold its position too much. But up here where it's drier, you can see that it does. And I'm not really painting anything other than abstract shapes, although that might be a tree. Just make different marks and see what's happening with the paint. Play around. It's a great doodle to do this. Doodle to do. See how the paint reacts relative to what you've already put down on the paper. You can see it's gripping and retaining its shape much more at the top. Down at the bottom here, not so much. It's starting to run out because it's still very wet. You learn an awful lot doing this, and you can't make a mistake really. There's no end result here. You're just playing around with the paint, observing what's happening. And so this rather strange exercise, it's what I call painting in threes. Your initial wash goes down. It could all be one colour, or it was a combination of two in this case. Then you paint more concentrated into that. That's number 2. And it must be more concentrated. If it isn't, you will get funny shapes and runbacks happening. And just before that dries, put in some even more concentrated paint, and you have a nice variety within this particular shape, albeit it's abstract. 1, 2, 3. Now you could do 4 or 5, 6, 7, but the danger is you start to lose the freshness in your wash, and you don't want that to happen. And based on how quickly watercolour dries, in my experience, 3 different goes at this is about all you can manage. So that's painting in threes. I'm going to show you it in practice a little bit later, but for now let's just park that and look at how we can add some texture into our paintings by varying our washes and varying our brush strokes. Now I'm going to make a very simple painting here of some cliffs, and these are a similar shape to many of the cliffs that I see along the Jurassic Coast in Dorset, and these cliffs often have a lot of texture to them when you look at them. There's scree, little bits of stones and rock tumbling down the sides of the cliff. Landslips have taken them there, and lots of little bits of grass and shrubs and foliage that grow on the edge of the cliff too. And it would be a big mistake for us just to paint it with a flat wash because it doesn't suggest the texture. The wash would look dull, boring and uninteresting. So we need to find a way of capturing some texture, which is not easy in watercolour because We don't have impasto techniques like we can use in oils to build up relief within a painting. It's all going to be down to a variety of brush strokes and some different washes. Now, unlike the vast majority of the painting I do, I'm actually going to start off with some darker tones here, and I'm going to create a broken wash. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to paint a glaze over the top of it. And you'll see that the combination of those two things together creates a rather nice textured effect. We looked at that very briefly when we looked at the different types of watercolour washes. Let's have a look at it again. So I'm going to use the colours that are on the palette here, light red and ultramarine. Make a nice warm grey, and that's perfect for the underpainting. What I've got also here is a damp brush, and to get the right dampness to this, I make it very wet, so you can see it's dripping water, and then I will dry it off on my towel at the side. I can still see it's damp. There's no real quantity of water in the hairs there that's going to cause problems, and I'll show you why we need that. So what I'm going to do here is allow the brush to make some marks on the side of the cliff to suggest shadow, texture, undulations, and the rough paper here is going to give me that texture. And I'll just drag these down the cliff in the direction that things would naturally be falling. Go back into the wash, pick up some slightly different colour. It's not an easy technique, this, by any stretch of the imagination, but the reason I do it at this point is because the paper is at its most resistant to the paint, and so it helps with these broken techniques. Now I get my damp brush, and I just want to soften off some of these hard edges because it looks a bit mechanical and uniform. Let's soften that off down there. Here and along the top too. And that's now just starting to give us quite a nice suggestion of texture. But while this is still damp, I'm going to drop in some dark colours into here in just a couple of places that are really dark shadows. Might be underneath a crack in the rock here. And do this now while this is just damp enough to give you some soft marks. Let's run some down from the top as well. There's no way of teaching you where to put these marks, and as you can see, I have no reference here. I'm just doing this from having stared at these type of cliffs for hours on end while I've been sitting on a beach or out sketching, and you just build up a memory bank of what they look like, and that's it. That's fine. What I should probably do is also a little suggestion of them on the distant cliff here, but perhaps not quite so much, and with a little less detail, because we're imagining that just running off into the distance. In fact, I don't think I'll put any darker tones into that, and then just let that dry. Now while that's just drying, I'm going to do the same thing here on this tree trunk, and let's just use a little bit of burnt umber, I think, and some ultramarine again, and I'm going to keep this fairly dark because I'm going to want this texture to show through the wash that I'll put on top. But again, with a dry brush, I'm just going to drag the brush down the tree trunk here in a few places, perhaps around here too. See, I'm holding it almost horizontal to the paper which allows me to use the belly of the brush to achieve these type of effects with rough paper. I'll rinse my brush out, dry it off on my towel, and then, as I did with the cliffs, I will just soften some of the areas here. Take some of the paint that inevitably collects on the brush, take it out of the hairs, dry it off again, go back in. Then with the rigger, let's get some ultramarine and burnt umber, nice dark mix of that. And I don't know, let's have a crack in the bark here. Nice little hole perhaps where an owl might be hanging out. Don't overdo these marks, less is more, but just a few of these will add a wonderful amount of texture to the tree. That's it, no more than that. Okay, now that the marks that I put on the cliff face are dry, I can wash over that. With one wash, it will unite the whole area, and a combination of the glaze with this underpainting will give us a nice rendition of this cliff face here. I've got some green mixed up on the palette here, and let's just start by painting this grassy sward at the top of the cliff here. Vary the colour. You don't just want a monotonous green on the top here. That's a surefire way to spoil the visual interest of your painting. Leave a few gaps there. That could be stones, bits of chalk, that type of thing. Rinse your brush out, and I'm going into this nice warm mix of yellow ochre and light red, and I'm going to pick up that green, and I want it to run down into this. There's no need for there to be a hard edge there. This is all very wet, so I can work it together. Now the key when you're putting this glaze on is to be very delicate. There's no prizes whatsoever for being heavy-handed. And just simply bring the wash over the top of what you've painted. Oodles of wet paint going on here, just so you don't disturb those marks underneath, because it will soften them slightly, and that is quite a nice effect. It stops it from looking too abrupt. Now, what I can do while this is still wet, I can paint this area of cliff behind. I'm painting it cooler because it's in the distance. I don't mind these two running together because my underpainting has defined these two separate areas. This is still wet. I can drop some other colour into here just to provide a little bit of variety. And then with my number 6 brush, I think I better put some green on the top here as well. Now with this glaze, I can bring back my idea of painting in threes. This is starting to dry. My glaze that I put on the green, the yellow, that's number 1. Here we go with number 2. I think a bit of madder in there with the ultramarine would be nice. I have to make sure this isn't too runny, otherwise I will get runbacks. So let's mix up quite a nice concentrated mix of that. And then what I'm going to do is just drop that in a few areas to suggest shadow. And you have to be careful doing this because you don't want to obliterate the underpainting. And you don't want to make it look too busy, but there might just be some places where in your judgment you feel that this could be improved by putting in a more concentrated tone. How about something in there? Now I'm going back to my darks. I'll just wait for that to dry a little bit more, to the point where it's just on the verge of drying, and then I will touch in some of these darker tones. And again, use your judgment. Have a look at what's happened on the paper and think, okay, where does this need something? How about down there? There's clearly a lot of shade down here, so there could be a little crevasse under there. Why not suggest something like that? Perhaps something up there too. Again, less is more, but by dropping in this third colour mix, you're adding some definition, and this whole area is starting to get a little bit of zip to it. Now what you don't want to do is go and plaster it all over the distant headland, because then that's going to jump forward. So be sensible about it and focus most of your firepower on either areas around focal points or areas that are coming forward into the foreground. That's it, I'm going to leave it there. Now that our tree's dry, I'm going to do the same here. So let's have this side of the tree catching some light. Again, be careful how you go over your underpainting. You don't want to scrub it off at all. Let's come down there with that nice shadow colour. Let that run in. Still have a bit of light on this side of the tree. As you can see, I'm using lots of wet paint again. I don't want to disturb those underpainted marks there. Now I'm going to mix up some darker mix here of umber and French ultramarine. I put the glaze over the top of the underpainting. That's number one. I'm going to drop in some of this darker brown mix in places. That's number two. And just as that's starting to dry up, let's get a nice sticky mix here. Again, burnt umber, ultramarine makes a lovely sort of browny black dirty colour, but it's fresh. It's a wonderful way of getting a nice crisp dark. Now that's almost at the point of drying, and I can just touch in a couple of very dark tones to give it a bit more definition. I'm still painting in threes. Here we are. This is the third pass at this particular wash. So hopefully you've seen with both these examples that a combination of underpainting, letting it dry, and then glazing over the top enables you to create subtle texture and detail in your painting, and it makes the washes that you're putting down have a lot of visual interest. No more boring washes. These are starting to look quite good. And then when I put the glaze over the top of the areas that I had painted initially, the broken washes, I've painted those using my painting in threes methodology. Initial wash goes on. As it's drying up, you put a more concentrated wash in, these shadows, these darker areas on the tree, and then just before it dries, some of these darker marks that help to give definition and more texture to the area that you're painting. It's a good methodology. Have a go at these exercises, have a go at just painting that abstract shape, and what will happen is you'll start to get used to the timings that you need and the consistency of the paint mixes at those different stages. You're not going to get it right first time. It took me a long time to find a way of rendering passages in a painting like this that are quite confusing and quite difficult and often become overworked and look a bit messy. But I found that using a combination of underpainting and glaze, and then also when you have an opportunity to paint in threes, your washes start to look rather good. So that's shown you the mechanics and the concept of painting in threes. And we've also had a look at varying brush strokes, making a broken wash, putting a glaze over the top, and how we can use that to introduce texture into our paintings. These help to give it visual interest, but let's have a look at a small painting that I've done that I think lacks visual interest. And then I'll isolate some of the components in that painting and I'll paint them again using the techniques we've just looked at so that it starts to look more appealing. So I've made this little painting in the corner of the paper here just to demonstrate the extent to which uniformity can kill your paintings. Let's be honest, there's not all that much that's wrong with this. It's technically okay. The colours are fresh, they're transparent, they're not muddy. The shapes have been accurately painted. But it's just so boring. So let's have a look at some of the things that we could do better to remove some of the uniformity here. Let's start with the trees. I mean, they're not too bad. We've got light on this side, we've got shade on that side, but it's all rather ordinary. The shapes are perhaps too well defined. Then let's take the area of grass here. It's just a flat green colour. It's probably the right colour, but it's boring. There's no visual interest here. I mean, if this was a piece of astroturf or something, then fair enough, but it's unlikely to be that, given that it's got a barn on top of it and we're in the countryside somewhere. So I think we can discount that quite easily. It needs something to give it some interest. It's boring, it's dull, it's flat. Same with the roof here. Is a barn roof likely to be just one wash of light red? I don't think so. There'll be all manner of things going on. Loose tiles, clumps of moss, bird droppings, you name it, it'll be on the roof. Let's look at the barn itself. We've got wooden slats painted here, and every single one has been put in. It leaves nothing to the imagination and therefore makes it look too uniform. It's the same with the fence. Every single post and both rails have been painted in. I imagine this to be a open area, big double door that you can, I don't know, drive your tractor in or whatever you want to do. And again, it's probably accurate, but I think we could probably do better than that. Well, let's start by finding a better way to paint the roof. I've got a mix of light red here, I've got a shadow colour here, and immediately that's a good start. Let's not just paint it all one flat colour, let's just mix it up a bit. And as I'm painting this shape, try to use the texture of the paper. Leave some white gaps here to suggest things on the roof. Let's pick up our shadow colour, while this is all wet. That's nice. They're both a similar consistency, so they're running together quite nicely. Now I'm just teasing this down the paper, and the two colours are running together, and then finish off along the bottom edge. But it doesn't need to be perfectly straight either, just keep it like that. Now I'm painting in threes again. First wash. Here comes the second as this is starting to dry up. I'm going to mix up some green, and as this is drying I'm just going to drop the green at the bottom edge of the roof because that's where moss tends to collect. There you are. Let's drop some of that in. Because this is now starting to dry and this is a more concentrated mix, you can see that it's holding its shape. First wash, the green, is our second edition, and our final one for our painting in thirds methodology will be some darks, and let's just use some burnt umber and whatever was left on the palette there. That just needs to dry off a little bit more. It's still got quite a nice sheen to it, so I just want it to be a bit damper than that before I put these final marks onto the roof. Now that's almost at a point where it's dry, and just before it dries let's introduce some darker marks. A few horizontal ones just suggests roof tiles, but these are soft edged because this area is still damp, and it just adds texture and it adds visual interest to this part of the painting. There we are, that's quite enough. So just that simple shape on the roof has been given a lot of visual interest. We've got colour variation in there, we've got moss growing on the roof tiles, we've suggested a few of those tiles in, we've dropped in some darker marks that just help to further define the roof. And that's a far more pleasing outcome than just this bland shape that we've got here in the little picture at the top. Now I've mixed up a couple of colours here for the side of the barn. I'll show you a good way of painting that too. Some burnt umber and ultramarine there, and then some ultramarine and a little bit of light red for that grey. And I'm not joining it up to this, I'm just going to show you how I do that particular element. Start at the top, as always, paint down. Just leave one or two little gaps there. That's okay. Change up the colours. Back into our brown colour. I'm painting that and blocking that in there just because that's where the door's going to go. Come down this side again, leave a few little cracks. You know, that's the case with a barn. There's all manner of gaps in the boards. They're drafty old things. You don't want to paint it like this, so it looks as though it's just come out of some sort of a outhouse brochure or something. We've just got a very slight bit of variation there because I've used two colours. They're very similar in tone, they're very similar in hue, but there's just enough there to create some visual interest. And in doing that, we are removing the uniformity that is spoiling this little painting. Now again, as this wash starts to dry, I'm just going to suggest some of these horizontal lines for the boards on this elevation. And I'm going to put some in so that they're soft edged, because once it dries, I'm going to put a couple in that are hard edged too. And that combination of textures, the contrast between some marks that are soft and some marks that are crisp, again, it's a wonderful way of adding visual interest and texture into your paintings. So here goes, this is almost dried, and I'll just run a couple of marks in with the rigger. Again, the important thing is not to paint every single board. It just becomes too monotonous, too prosaic. That's enough with the soft edges. Now, just while that's drying up, I'm going to show you one thing here quickly that, again, doesn't help or contribute positively in the painting above. Look at this line here that runs all the way along the base of the roof. There's nothing wrong with it, but it just looks too formal. It looks too abrupt. So taking this roof here that I painted, this is what I would suggest you do, because you might still want some definition. Often where roofs overhang, there is a dark edge to them. The key is just not to do it all the way along. Pick a couple of places. And leave it at that. It just looks so much better. And the reason that this looks better, just a little bit of hit and miss, is because we've left something to the imagination. We haven't spelt it out in its entirety, as we have here with one solid line that runs all the way along. So keep things like that in mind. Hit and miss, it helps to make your washes look interesting. It takes away the monotony, it takes away the predictability, and as a consequence, they don't look boring. Now, while I'm just waiting for that to dry before I put the door on, I want to show you something relative to this painting that I think is very, very important. You may well have heard artists say, and in fact, I'm pretty sure I've said it on a number of occasions, and that is, stop fiddling. Often you get this little brush, a rigger brush or a pointer, whatever you want to call it, in your hand, and you start painting in detail where you don't need to paint it in. Why is it we do that? Well, quite simply, it's because we're not satisfied with what we've done up to that point. And so we think that more is required in order to make our painting look better. This is a classic example. If I have a look at the tree here, and there's quite an expanse of foliage to the right of the barn, I could be tempted to think, well, it's just too bland, so I need to put something in here. So what have I got? I've got some brown here. Let's put the tree in here, and you start painting the tree, and it doesn't merge into anything. This is summer foliage. It's quite stark, and it doesn't really look right, even though, you know, it's not that the shape is wrong that I'm painting, but it's just not quite right. There are better ways of doing it than this, and we start putting these heavy shapes and details perhaps where they shouldn't go, and you think, yeah, that's better. It's not quite as boring as it was previously. but it's not quite right. These are distant trees and you've just put a bit too much work into them. Same for the grass. You think, well, it's really flat, so I'm not happy with it and I need to make a few changes here. So let's put in some grass. Always a classic. And you can make a few of these marks here and there, and that's fine, but when you've got a monotonous area like this, you start to fill it up with a lot of hard-edged marks and unnecessary detail. And you've done it once, you don't really know where to stop, and you keep doing it. And this all arises from the simple fact that your initial washes that you put down were boring and not very interesting. You weren't satisfied with them, and so you thought, well, I better put some more work into them, and you start fiddling, and this is what happens. Okay, now our barn elevation has dried, so I'm going to put the door in, and even though this is a small area, it's still a wash, and it can still be painted using our methodology of painting in threes. I'm going to start off with some warm colour here, because there might be some light bouncing off something inside the barn. And I'm going to paint the whole area in this colour. Just get that on. And then I'm going to mix up some dark shadow colour here. Use some light red with that, I think. It's more concentrated than what I've already painted. It's very important. And I'm going to drop that in now while this is still wet. The brown, the warm colour, number 1. This blue colour, or grey colour I should say, that I'm dropping in. It's number 2. You see, now you're getting a sense that there's some light in here and that there's some areas of darkness as well. It's far more pleasing than this dull square that's painted on the side of the barn. Now, as that's starting to dry, let's get some more darks mixed up here. Burnt umber, French ultramarine, really nice and dark this. In fact, while that's just drying up, I might put in some of these hard-edged marks on the barn here, which I was saying gives contrast. We've got some soft lines here that I put in earlier, and then we'll just pick out a couple of boards in hard edge. Let's make that into a bit of a gap between the two there. That's fine. Okay, so that's drying up quite nicely now. It's still a bit damp, but I can just put in some dark. This is my 3rd pass at this wash. There we go. Gives some depth underneath the beam across the top of the door. Why don't we come down the side as well? Keep loading that in there. It's really sticky, this mix, so it's not going to cause you any run back issues. I quite like the warmth down in that bottom corner, so I'm not going to do anything there. Now this is starting to look like somewhere that we can walk into. There's some warmth in there, there's some shade, there's things happening. This, well, if you walk into that, you're just going to get concussion. The difference between the two is significant, and this reads much better. It adds more visual interest to the painting. Okay, let's have a look at the trees and the grass, see if there's a better way of rendering those. And believe it or not, if we paint in threes again, I think we'll find that there is. So I've got some colours mixed up here. I've got some sunlit green for the left-hand side of the trees and some darker green for the shadow side. I've got a damp number 6 brush still. I'm going to need that. And what we're trying to do here is just vary the texture, vary the wash, create visual interest by removing the uniformity. So let's start off with a nice big brush and paint on the side here. So you get these nice broken marks. Already that's looking much more like a tree. Get some of our shadow colour, let that run in there as well. Let's join them up because we did that there. They're sort of denser as you go down towards the area of grass. And then what I'm going to do is immediately paint the grass in underneath that. Now, here's my green, and I'm going to come along the bottom of these trees and let them just bleed down into the grass, connect that all up together, leave some broken marks like this. It could be anything, daisies, small flowers, stones, pebbles, things grow in grass. Let's put a little bit of red into the mix as well because it just varies the colour up and it allows us to retain some visual interest in the painting. I'll finish off with that dark green colour there. Now with the damp brush I'm just going to soften off a couple of these edges. Again, it gives variety. We've got hard edges here. We've got a few soft edges now that are developing. You can use your finger too if you want to enhance that effect further. Now we're going to go to our second approach to this large connected wash, and I'm going to mix some shadow colour, red and blue. A bit of yellow just to calm it down a bit. It's a lot more concentrated than the wash that I put down, and I'm just going to drop that in around the base of these trees. And I think I might just run it all the way along there actually, because that's probably a shadow or something underneath those trees. A little bit of shadow there. Vary it up. This is what grass is like. There's things growing in here. Okay, and now that the trees are almost dry, I can just suggest in one or two little marks that might indicate trunks and branches. There's a shape there. I'll make use of that. And how about something just running up through there? And it's all wet, it's running together. It's not all hard and crisp as I've got here, which is out of place for where that is in the painting. Just drop in a few more darks. Some here just to suggest shadow perhaps behind stones or whatever your imagination suggests to you that those things are. And I really don't need to do any more to this than just leave it alone. It's rendered this area here with a lot more visual interest. There's broken edges, hard edges, soft edges. We've got lights, we've got darks running together. I put this all down first as number 1, then we went in with the blue down into here as number 2, and then for number 3 I started to drop in some of these very dark areas while it's all damp and allowed it all to come together. It takes a lot of practice to get this timing right, but by doing these small little exercises enables you to do that without the risk of spoiling a big painting. You can just keep doing these and play around with the consistency of the paint on your palette, the timing of how wet or damp the paper or the wash is when you put more paint onto it. And you will see that sometimes it all goes wrong and you put paint in that's far too dilute and you get odd shapes and runbacks that you hadn't anticipated. Don't worry about that. It's all part of the learning process. But the more that you do these type of things, the more you start to gain confidence and the more you understand the relationship between consistency of paint and the dampness of the paper. And once you've mastered it, it becomes so useful and versatile. As you can see, it doesn't matter whether I'm doing a roof or trees or the open door of a barn. Painting in threes is something that crops up in all my paintings, and it helps me to create visual interest for the viewer. Now, I'm sure you know what's coming next, and let's be perfectly honest, this would not be a credible tutorial if we didn't spend some time talking about fence posts. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, I've spent years in counselling trying to find a way to overcome the trauma of not painting every single fence post that I see. Such is my attachment to them, and as you know, they crop up all over the place in my paintings. But we can't do this. We can't put in every post. We can't put in every rail because it just looks too uniform. Yes, they might be there. Doesn't matter. You have to find a way of rendering an area like this that is busy, and you need to find a way to make it less distracting because it is introducing too much uniformity into the painting. So, what are we going to do? Well, for a start, make quick marks with your brush. And I often have the fence post larger at the top than at the bottom. There's a particular reason for that, but that's just how I paint them. There's one. Have another fairly close to it, but just at a slightly different angle and a slightly different size. And then maybe we'll put one in here, one here. This isn't really the subject of this video, but I will mention it, and we'll come onto this at some point in another video when we look at composition. But we want one over here, but you don't want that gap to be repeated here. So let's sort of put it in there, I think. That's fine. And then, yes, we want to have some of the rails, but again, be dynamic with your brush strokes and simply suggest them. You can maybe have one coming down like this. That's probably it, actually. I'm not going to put any more in than that. That's all that you need to do to tell the viewer that there's a fence here. It's a far more satisfying arrangement than, you know, this railway track that's been stood up on its end and propped up next to the barn. It just doesn't look good. Don't paint fences like this. They will create far too much uniformity in your painting and will just start to strangle the life out of it. Well, thanks very much for watching, and there's some fun exercises there for you to be going on with. Do them as many times as you like. Become familiar with this idea of painting in threes and how the concentration of paint and the wetness of the paper and the wash have an impact on the end result. Once you get the hang of it, you'll find that opportunities to use those techniques crop up all the time in your paintings. And as you become more skillful, you'll start to notice a dramatic change in your paintings. They will start to have visual interest. Now, weather permitting, in the next few weeks, I'm hoping to get out and about, do a little bit of location filming. We're going to go to some nice places that I like to paint. I'll have my sketchbook with me. I'm going to show you the importance of sketching outdoors, how to find subjects, what sort of equipment you might need to make your life easier. And I think it'll be a lot of fun, so hopefully you'll stick around for that. In the meantime though, take care. I'll see you next time.